So we've worked our way through human evolution to the point where most human populations look more like you and me than they do a chimpanzee. And they've expanded their territory throughout most hospitable areas of 3 continents. But Homo erectus and his contemporaries are still not fully human, especially in terms of behavior. Today, we'll bridge that gap between sort of human and human. There are 2 sets of chronological terms that become important here. The Middle Pleistocene dates from about 780,000 to 125,000 years ago and represents the period when these pre-modern humans evolved out of Homo erectus. The Late Pleistocene then dates from 125,000 to 10,000 years ago and is the period during which Neandertals and modern humans are the most well-known forms. That's the geological chronology. However, since we're now looking at time periods with a comparatively complex archaeological record, we can also start talking about cultural time periods. When we're looking at cultural developments, especially the development of new stone tool technologies, the Middle Pleistocene is considered part of the Lower Paleolithic. The technologies of Neanderthal populations and related groups are usually called Middle Paleolithic, and technologies associated with Homo sapiens sapiens late in the Late Pleistocene are called Upper Paleolithic. This lower, middle, upper terminology might seem a little odd when early, middle, late refer more directly to time. However, deeper geological deposits are older than those closer to the surface, so they include older artifacts. In archaeological sites with artifacts from different time periods, therefore, the lower artifacts are the older ones. Hence, Upper Paleolithic is automatically the youngest, and so on. But let's go back to the Middle Pleistocene and Lower Paleolithic first, and look at how our ancestors physically changed from Homo erectus. For many years, the general consensus among most paleoanthropologists was that Homo erectus populations throughout the world slowly evolved, mostly in place, into Homo sapiens. When fossils were found that seemed to be partway between erectus and modern sapiens, they were considered transitional and called Archaic Homo sapiens. The implication from this terminology was that, by and large, there was nothing of particular importance or interest happening in this time period. These populations didn't need their own labels because there wasn't much to say about them anyway. Today, with modern techniques, there's a lot more that can be said about these Middle Pleistocene people. Now, the emerging consensus is that many Archaic Homo sapiens fossils are better labeled Homo Heidelbergensis and should be seen as a distinct phase between erectus and sapiens. Is it a significant change? Not at all, since all of these are only paleospecies. As your textbook points out at the end of this chapter, all the species discussed here were probably able to interbreed successfully and therefore probably belong to the same biological species. What use is Heidelbergensis then? It gives us a useful label for talking about a specific important phase of human evolution that Archaic Homo sapiens did not. That phase is between about 850,000 and 200,000 years ago in Africa and southern Europe. In these regions, during that period, erectus populations seem to have evolved into Homo heidelbergensis with larger brains, thinner crania, and a generally more modern appearance. It's important to note, though, that Homo heidelbergensis never lived in most of Asia. It's a specifically African and European species. One important find from Africa is the Bodo Skull, dating to about 600,000 years ago. This is interesting because it shows cut marks. When this individual died, his companions used stone tools to remove the flesh from his skull. They may have been processing him just like any game animal, and for the same reason, to eat, or they may have been performing some kind of ritual. For many cultures around the world even today, the first phases of funeral rituals involve the removal of soft tissue from the skeleton. If the Bodo skull indicates that sort of processing, it may also indicate that our Homo heidelbergensis ancestors were developing ideas akin to modern religion. The oldest Heidelbergensis site anywhere may be in the Atapuerca region of Spain, which we mentioned last time. There are two important cave sites here, Sima del Elefante and Grandolina. The Spanish anthropologists who excavated Grandolina, the older of the two sites, have suggested that it and Sima del Elefante represent a new species, Homo antecessor. But other scholars have suggested Sima del Elefante is Homo erectus, and Grandolina is the earliest Homo heidelbergensis. Antecessor would then be a label overlapping the transition between the others, which, given the arbitrary nature of paleospecies, is understandable. Another Atapuercan cave is also important for understanding Heidelbergensis. Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, is a deep pit in the back of a cave that filled with various hominin and animal bones about 500 to 400,000 years ago. There's no obvious way for the 28 individual hominins to have fallen in accidentally. The pit is very far back in the dark zone of the cave, where natural light has never penetrated, and getting there is very difficult. Because of this, the researchers have suggested that the hominins were intentionally thrown in after death, that this represents the first known special disposal of the dead in human history. It's not burial per se, but it's close, and it may suggest some level of ritualization surrounding human life, similar to some interpretations of the Bodo Skull. Were our ancestors developing spiritual concepts by 400,000 years ago? It's starting to look possible. I should also note that the Cima de los Huesos fossils have yielded the earliest DNA yet recovered from any hominins. Fossilization usually destroys DNA by replacing the organic molecules with mineral crystals, but in certain circumstances, when bones have not been completely fossilized, DNA can survive. Based on mitochondrial DNA mentioned in your textbook, the Cima de los Huesos population was originally thought to have been more closely related to a later Siberian population called Denisovans, rather than later European populations. However, more recent nuclear DNA results show this to be at best unlikely. These Homo heidelbergensis were almost certainly ancestral to later European Neanderthals. That's what's happening in Europe and Africa during the Middle Pleistocene. In Asia, the Middle Pleistocene is much more complicated. In Africa and Europe, most people agree that there was a transition, with Erectus being succeeded by Heidelbergensis. In Asia, that's not the case. Erectus seems to have hung around as a recognizable species for a lot longer, until perhaps 150,000 years ago at Ngandung in Indonesia. And some Chinese scholars believe that Erectus evolved directly into sapiens, without any major influx of foreign DNA. Exactly what happened in Asia during this period is still very much up in the air. We'll discuss several different theories about this controversy in the next lecture. Outside of Asia, though, at the end of the Middle Pleistocene, we have Heidelbergensis in Africa and Europe, and possibly in parts of Western Asia. Generally speaking, most people agree that the European populations evolved into Neandertals, and that African populations became Homo sapiens. Before we move on to a closer look at Neanderthals, let's look at the culture of Heidelbergensis. The earlier Erectus groups in Africa and Europe had adopted the Acheulean industry. Heidelbergensis maintained this toolkit throughout most of the Middle Pleistocene. Near the end, some Heidelbergensis populations seem to have invented a much more sophisticated technology called Levallois. The Levallois technique involves specially preparing a core in such a way that you know the shape of the final flake before you strike it, something that can't really be predicted with Acheulean techniques. With the Levallois technique, people could create smaller, more precise tools with a variety of specialized shapes. This made their tools generally more efficient. As far as other aspects of culture go, the groups seem to have been making more use of caves as natural shelters, though at places like Terra Amata in France, they also made freestanding structures about 380,000 years ago. These are the oldest prepared structures known. Patterns of staining in the soils at Terra Amata indicate that these huts were made by setting wooden poles in the ground to form a frame that was then probably covered with animal skins. The huts are long since decayed to dust, of course, but the patterns of post holes remain, showing the size and shape of the structures that once stood there. Heidelbergensis probably ate a variety of foods and may have been increasingly successful at hunting rather than just scavenging recent kills made by other predators. Based on a variety of evidence, they also almost certainly had control of fire. Let's move now to Neanderthals. Around the end of the Middle Pleistocene, or the beginning of the Late Pleistocene, about 130,000 years ago or so, Heidelbergensis in Europe had evolved into a new form. The Pleistocene is popularly known as the Ice Age, and Europe in this period was extremely cold. After hundreds of thousands of years living in such a cold climate, Heidelbergensis had developed several adaptations that made life easier. These late Pleistocene European populations are known as classic Neanderthals because the first fossils, in fact the first recognized human ancestor fossils ever, were discovered in Germany's Neander River Valley in 1856, 3 years before The Origin of Species was published. Earlier European populations are viewed by some as transitional between Homo heidelbergensis and classic Neanderthals, and sometimes these are called Neanderthals as well, but your textbook refers to them as Homo heidelbergensis. A note on terminology here. The German word Neanderthal means Neander Valley and refers to the Neander River, where the first fossils were recovered. In the 19th century, the proper spelling in German was T-H-A-L, but German has always been pronounced with the hard T, not the English th sound. When the word was imported into English, English speakers pronounced it like any English word, with a th sound. Meanwhile, the modern spelling of Tal in German is T-A-L. So many paleoanthropologists now spell Neanderthal without the H and pronounce it like the German word that it is. But both spellings and pronunciations are acceptable. The biggest debate in paleoanthropology in the last 30 years or so has been how to classify Neanderthals. Many earlier scholars believed that Neanderthals were not directly ancestral to modern humans, but not distant enough to merit their own species name. So until the 1980s, they were often referred to as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, still our own species, just a branch of it. In the 1990s, the pendulum swung, and many paleoanthropologists classified them as Homo neanderthalensis, a distinct species. This name is still used, especially by non-scientists, but general agreement is returning to the idea that Neanderthals should be considered a subspecies. DNA analyses show that Neanderthals and modern humans are 99.84% genetically identical, which is certainly close enough to belong to the same species. Also, we have several fossils and ample DNA evidence of interbreeding. Modern non-African populations have 1.5 to 2.1% of their DNA originating from Neanderthals, which suggests that interbreeding took place soon after modern humans migrated out of Africa. We'll return to these issues next lecture. What sets those populations apart from us, though? Most of the differences lie in the cold climate adaptations I alluded to before. Neanderthals are stockier and more robust, which is good for maintaining body heat and living in dangerous winter environments. They have bigger noses that helped to warm cold air when they inhaled, bigger teeth for using as tools to grip and rip, and so on. The most surprising trait, though, is brain size. While all of human evolution has been a slow trend toward larger brains, the Neanderthals have even larger brains than modern humans, who eventually replaced them. Sapiens brains average between 1,300 and 1,400 cubic centimeters. Neanderthal brains average about 1,520 cubic centimeters. However, their bodies were also generally more massive, and this small increase is really more a result of larger overall body size. So because Neanderthals had larger bodies and slightly larger brains, their encephalization ratios are roughly equal to anatomically modern humans. In fact, in most physical and probably cognitive and cultural traits, Neanderthals were largely comparable to modern human populations. Most Neanderthals fell within the range of variation for modern humans, just nearer the upper, more robust end. A well-dressed and groomed Neanderthal could probably walk down the street in a major city and not draw a second glance. This particular reconstruction shows how similar we and they are once cultural things like clothing are taken out of the equation. So why the popular image of Neanderthals as hulking, bent-over brutes living in caves and grunting? This popular image dates back to the early 20th century and the Neanderthal finds at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France. This was a cave where, in 1908, some of the very first Neanderthal remains were recovered. When asked to create a museum display recreating the site, the paleontologist Marcelin Boule misinterpreted the burial. Because so little was known about human evolution at the time, he overemphasized the pre-modern aspects of the skeleton and made his reconstruction much more ape-like than it should have been. He misinterpreted an older man's osteoarthritis, a pathological condition that bent his spine, and considered it to be a typical trait of all Neanderthals, and so he showed them as slouched. The other caveman aspects of his reconstruction were basically just poor guesses based on Boule's Victorian-era prejudices about the past. Unfortunately, his museum display was wildly popular, and after more than a century, Boule's incorrect depiction of Neanderthals remains the popular image. Aside from La Chapelle, other important European Neanderthal sites include El Cedrón Cave in Spain, which shows some pretty strong evidence for cannibalism among Neanderthals. It also indicates patrilocal residence. Since the El Cedrón fossils probably made up an extended family unit, scholars looked at the DNA of the individuals. The men were all closely related to one another, but the women were not. This suggests that men remained with their birth families throughout life, and women left their birth groups to join their mates, that is, their husbands. Sites at Saint-Césaire in France and Vendia in Croatia also show that Neanderthals and anatomically modern Homo sapiens were living in the same regions for millennia at the end of the Neanderthal time span. That evidence is strengthened by Neanderthal remains on the fringes of their European homeland, especially in Southwestern Asia. In what are now Israel, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, there is evidence that Neanderthals lived alongside modern humans for thousands of years. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, there is also ample evidence of quite modern behavior among Neanderthals. Among the several burials there is an old man, 30 to 40 years old, but that was very old for Neanderthals, with really severe disabilities. Due to massive injuries, he was partially blind and had lost the use of an arm. He was also unable to walk due to a broken leg that had healed poorly. He must have been cared for by his community, and much more completely than, say, the Denisovans, Homo erectus with no teeth. Aside from classic Neanderthals, there were other pre-modern populations during the late Pleistocene. Many of them in various portions of Asia or northern Africa have no specific label other than Neanderthal-like, but the Denisovans have been granted their own designation. The Denisovans are known from two small fossils, a finger bone and a tooth, from Denisova Cave in Siberia. DNA was extracted from these fossils in 2000, with the expectation that they'd belong to the Siberian variation of Neanderthal. It was quite a surprise, therefore, when the DNA showed that these fossils were not from Neanderthals at all, but a closely related population. Thus far, aside from the existence of Denisovans, we don't know much about them. In terms of culture, Neanderthals continued the traditions they inherited from their Heidelbergensis predecessors and improved on it. They further developed the Levallois Technique and added it to their distinctive stone toolkit called Mousterian. Mousterian tools are more standardized and regularly made than earlier traditions, making use of a wider variety of specialized shapes. Levallois flakes, the final goal of the Levallois Technique, were probably hafted to wooden handles, for which there is hardly any prior evidence, and used as knives or as spearheads. Finally, as far as technology is concerned, Neanderthals appear to have made extremely little use of bone. A few examples exist, including one bird bone that may have been a flute, but many, many fewer than contemporary Homo sapiens. That technology was put to use surviving in a very cold, very dangerous European environment. Neanderthals appear to have been very effective hunters, with hafted points and ample evidence of large-scale butchering at residential sites. However, their lack of throwing spears or other distance weapons meant they had to get very close to their prey to kill it. In the Pleistocene, when many animals had grown very large to adapt to the cold, that was very dangerous. Erik Trinkaus, one of the leading Neanderthal experts, compared known Neanderthal injuries to modern groups and found that they were most similar to modern rodeo cowboys, people who regularly get thrown and trampled by big, angry animals with really hard hooves. The other big cultural question about Neanderthals pertains to their speech and symbolic behavior. We're increasingly coming to the conclusion that Neanderthals' speech organs were essentially the same as ours, and the relevant brain structures for controlling those organs were also the same. Therefore, Neanderthals were probably physically capable of articulate speech, but what isn't clear is whether they were mentally capable of the cognitive feats necessary to use articulate speech. Remember that human language, true human language, involves the ability to think about and talk about abstract concepts and possible situations. In modern humans, abstract communication is closely tied to symbolic behavior, which, for our purposes, can be thought of primarily as figurative art, that is, drawing pictures of things. When Homo sapiens and Neanderthal populations lived side by side, Homo sapiens seems always to have been making figurative art. Evidence for art making among Neanderthals is extremely rare, and even the best evidence is quite doubtful. That bird bone flute may be the earliest example of music making, another kind of art, or it may just be a bird bone with a couple little holes drilled in it. Neanderthals do seem to have made some beads and jewelry, but nothing representational, no pictures of things. Your textbook, figure 10.22, shows a shell pendant that was probably painted. Some paleoanthropologists, such as Stephen Mithen, argue that this indicates that Neanderthals were not able to think symbolically in the same way we do, and therefore could not have been capable of what we would call real language. In this view, the brain is anatomically modern, but the mind is not. It's like two identical computers running different software. The Neanderthal operating system is not capable of symbolic thought, but Homo sapiens OS is. On the other hand, one aspect of Neanderthal archaeology that does seem to strongly suggest symbolic thought is Neanderthal burial practices. The earliest unequivocal evidence of human burials occurs in Neanderthal sites like La Chapelle in France, Tablin in Israel, and Shanidar in Iraq. These burials are intentional, with purpose-dug graves, a standard position to the body, flexed, and often some kind of burial good like tools or animal bones. This suggests a belief in an afterlife, that the dead person would use the burial goods at some point. This is thus the earliest straightforward evidence of human religion found anywhere, and it is found in early Neanderthal contexts as far back as 90,000 years ago at Taubin. Of course, special treatment of the dead at the Pit of Bones may have gone all the way back to Homo Heidelbergensis, so religion may not have been an invention of Neanderthals. In wrapping this lecture up, let me make one general note. This material is very complex and even more difficult to master in an online setting. Be sure to read the textbook carefully and make full use of the discussion forums to ask questions about anything that isn't clear. It's vital to engage with the material rather than simply trying to memorize it. Use the tools available to master the material.